John had always been the kind of person who thought 10 steps ahead. He wasn't flashy or loud, but when it came to planning, he was meticulous, almost obsessive. That trait served him well in life, especially when he decided to buy his dream property. It was a piece of land that seemed straight out of a storybook. 5 lush acres surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides and bordered by a quiet country road on the 4th. The air smelled fresh, the birds chirped endlessly, and there wasn't another house in sight for miles. To John, it felt like paradise. But even before signing the papers, John knew this place wouldn't come without its challenges. For one thing, the land was part of a community governed by a homeowners association, HOA. These organizations are notorious for their strict rules about everything from lawn maintenance to paint colors. Still, John figured he could handle whatever they threw at him. After all, he'd done his research, or so he thought. The first red flag popped up almost immediately after moving in. Accessing his property wasn't as straightforward as driving down the country road and turning onto his driveway. Instead, there was an easement, a shared pathway maintained by the HOA, that ran through the neighboring development. This meant John had to cross through someone else's territory just to get home. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. The HOA assured him the easement would remain open and accessible. No questions asked. They even promised regular upkeep, keeping the gravel smooth and free of potholes. For the first few months, things went smoothly. John spent his days clearing brush, planting trees, and sketching plans for the cabin he wanted to build. Neighbors occasionally waved as they passed by, and the HOA board members greeted him warmly at meetings. Everything felt fine, until it wasn't. It started with small annoyances. A letter arrived saying John's temporary trailer parked near the construction site violated aesthetic guidelines. Then came complaints about how late he worked into the evening, claiming the noise disturbed nearby residents. Each issue felt trivial, but together they added up. John tried to stay calm, addressing each concern politely and making compromises where possible. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Then, one crisp autumn morning, John woke up to find barricades blocking the easement road. Bright orange cones and wooden barriers stretched across the entrance, along with a sign that read, "Road closed due to safety concerns." There was no explanation, no warning, and no indication of when or if the road would reopen. Furious and confused, John called the HOA office only to be met with vague excuses. "We're looking into it," they said. "There have been reports of erosion and structural instability. We need to prioritize safety." Safety? John couldn't believe what he was hearing. The easement had been perfectly fine just days ago. He walked the length of the blocked path himself, inspecting every inch. Sure, there were a few ruts here and there, but nothing that justified sealing off access entirely. Something about this situation didn't add up. Stranded and cut off from his own land, John felt a mix of anger and helplessness wash over him. How could the HOA do this? Didn't they realize how much effort and money he'd poured into this project? His mind raced, with worst-case scenarios. Would he lose his investment? Be forced to sell the land at a loss? Or worse, watch it sit unused while weeds reclaimed his hard work? As the hours passed, however, John's frustration began to give way to something else: determination. Over the years, he'd learned that panic rarely solved problems, but careful thinking often did. So instead of reacting impulsively, he sat down with a cup of coffee and reviewed every document related to his purchase. That's when he stumbled upon something extraordinary. Buried deep within the deed was a clause, a legal provision inserted by the previous owner. It stated that if any entity obstructed access to the property for more than 30 consecutive days, ownership of certain communal assets would automatically transfer to the affected homeowner. In other words, if the HOA kept the easement closed long enough, John could claim partial ownership of things like the clubhouse, swimming pool, and tennis courts. At first, John stared at the clause in disbelief. Was this real? Could such a provision actually exist? He double-checked the wording, consulted online resources, and eventually confirmed its validity. The previous owner must have included it as a safeguard against exactly this type of conflict. And now, thanks to the HOA's actions, John found himself holding a trump card he never expected to play. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just some bureaucratic oversight. It was a golden opportunity. If handled correctly, John could turn the tables on the HOA and regain control of his destiny. All he needed to do was wait patiently for the clock to tick past 30 days, and then activate the clause. But patience wasn't easy. Every day felt like an eternity as John watched the barricades remain firmly in place. He attended HOA meetings, pretending to plead for a solution while secretly counting down the days. Neighbors whispered behind his back, speculating why he hadn't taken legal action yet. Some assumed he lacked the resources. Others thought he was too scared to challenge the powerful board. What they didn't know was that John was letting them dig their own grave. By day 25, John hired a lawyer specializing in real estate law. Together, they prepared the necessary documents to enforce the clause. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down, issuing official letters declaring the easement closure permanent due to supposed zoning violations. Their arrogance only fueled John's resolve. On day 31, everything clicked into place. With a steady hand and a confident smile, John submitted the paperwork to both the county recorder's office and the HOA board. What happened next would change everything, not just for John, but for the entire neighborhood. When John first stumbled upon the peculiar clause in his property deed, he couldn't help but chuckle. It seemed almost too good to be true. A hidden trap buried deep within legal jargon that could give him immense leverage over the very people trying to control him. But as he read and reread the wording, the reality of it began to sink in. This wasn't just some quirky leftover from a previous owner's paranoia. It was a carefully crafted safeguard designed for situations exactly like this. The clause itself was straightforward. If access to John's property was obstructed for more than 30 consecutive days, whether intentionally or not, the ownership of certain communal assets would automatically transfer to the affected homeowner. These assets included parts of the HOA's prized clubhouse, recreational areas, and even portions of their shared amenities like the pool and tennis courts. Essentially, the HOA was sitting on a ticking time bomb they didn't even know existed. John remembered the day he discovered this gem during the title search before finalizing the purchase. At first glance, it struck him as unusual, almost eccentric. Why would anyone include such a specific condition in a deed? Most homeowners wouldn't bother with something so niche, but John isn't most homeowners. His meticulous nature kicked in, and he decided to investigate further. He reached out to the previous owner, an elderly man named Walter, who lived several states away. Over a phone call, Walter explained the backstory. Years ago, Walter had been embroiled in a similar dispute with the HOA. They'd tried to impose unreasonable restrictions on his use of the easement road, claiming vague safety concerns. Walter, fed up with their antics, hired a sharp attorney who inserted the clause into the deed as a deterrent. "I figured no one would mess with me if they knew what was at stake," Walter said with a laugh. Turns out I was right. The HOA backed off after that. Walter's story intrigued John. Here was proof that the HOA had a history of bullying homeowners, and Walter had fought back in his own clever way. Inspired by the tale, John decided to keep the clause intact when purchasing the property. In fact, he took it a step further. During negotiations, he quietly ensured the provision remained enforceable and updated the language slightly to reflect modern legal standards. He never imagined he'd actually need to use it, but now here he was. As John sat in his makeshift office, a folding table set up inside his trailer, he pulled out the original deed and studied the clause again. The wording was clear and precise, leaving little room for interpretation. If the HOA kept the easement blocked past the 30-day mark, John could file the necessary paperwork to claim partial ownership of their communal assets. The thought made him grin. Not only would this serve as sweet revenge, but it would also force the HOA to rethink their heavy-handed tactics. But patience was key. John knew better than to rush into anything. Activating the clause required careful timing and preparation. He spent hours researching local laws, reading case studies, and consulting online forums about real estate disputes. He wanted to make sure he understood every angle before making his move. Meanwhile, he continued playing the role of the frustrated yet powerless homeowner, attending HOA meetings and voicing his concerns about the blocked easement. At one meeting, John stood up and addressed the board directly. "Look, I understand you're concerned about safety," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But cutting off my access entirely is extreme. Surely there's a compromise we can reach." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for his reasonable demeanor. One of them muttered something about ongoing inspections, while another promised to look into alternative solutions. John nodded politely, pretending to accept their empty reassurances, all while silently counting down the days. Behind closed doors, however, John was anything but passive. Every evening he pored over documents, double-checking deadlines and gathering evidence to support his case. He snapped photos of the barricades, saved copies of correspondence with the HOA, and documented every interaction related to the dispute. He also started reaching out to neighbors, casually asking questions about the HOA's policies and listening intently to their grievances. Many were hesitant to speak openly, fearing retaliation, but John sensed a growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction. People were tired of the HOA's domineering attitude. They just needed someone brave enough to stand up to them. By day 20, rumors began circulating around the neighborhood. Some speculated that John was planning to sue the HOA, while others whispered about secret negotiations happening behind the scenes. None of these theories were true, of course, but John didn't bother correcting them. Letting the HOA squirm a little added an extra layer of satisfaction to the process. On day 25, John took the next critical step: hiring a lawyer. He chose someone with a reputation for handling complex real estate cases, someone who understood the nuances of property law and could navigate the intricacies of the clause. Together, they drafted the official paperwork required to activate the provision. The lawyer warned John that the HOA might fight back aggressively once they realized what was happening, but John remained unfazed. He trusted his preparation and knew the law was on his side. While John worked behind the scenes, the HOA grew increasingly brazen. On day 28, they sent him a formal letter stating that the easement closure was permanent due to irreparable damage caused by erosion. The letter went on to accuse John of exaggerating the impact of the blockade and suggested he find alternative routes to access his land. Reading the document, John felt a mix of amusement and disbelief. Did they really think he'd fold under pressure? Didn't they realize the clock was ticking? Each passing day brought John closer to his goal. By day 30, everything was ready. The paperwork was signed, stamped, and ready to file. All that remained was waiting for the final hours to tick by. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, John allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. Tomorrow, the game would change forever, not just for him, but for everyone involved. What John didn't fully anticipate, though, was the sheer chaos his actions would unleash. When the HOA finally received notice of the clause activation, their world would turn upside down. Panic, accusations, and desperate attempts to negotiate would follow. And through it all, John would remain calm, collected, and utterly unstoppable. Day 31 arrived, and John felt a mix of excitement and nerves bubbling inside him. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, triple-checking every detail to ensure nothing could go wrong. The paperwork was ready, the legal strategy was sound, and the clock had officially run out on the HOA's 30-day window. It was time to make his move. Early that morning, before the sun had fully risen, John drove to the county recorder's office. He parked his truck in the nearly empty lot, took a deep breath, and grabbed the folder containing all the documents he'd meticulously prepared. As he walked into the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was it. The moment when years of frustration would finally tip in his favor. The clerk at the counter greeted him with a polite smile. "How can I assist you today?" she asked. I'm here to file these documents, John replied, sliding the folder across the counter. Inside were copies of the deed, the clause activation notice, and supporting evidence proving the easement had been blocked for over 30 days. He watched as the clerk flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from curiosity to mild surprise. "This is quite detailed," she said after a moment, glancing up at him. "Are you sure you don't want to consult an attorney first?" John smiled confidently. "Already did. Everything's been reviewed and approved." She nodded and stamped the papers, officially recording them in the public record. With that simple act, John triggered the clause buried in his deed. Ownership of portions of the HOA's communal assets, like the clubhouse, pool, and tennis courts, now legally transferred to him. But the real drama was yet to unfold. Later that afternoon, John hand-delivered copies of the same documents to the HOA board members. He didn't trust email or certified mail. He wanted to see their faces when they realized what had happened. One by one, he visited each member at their homes, presenting them with the paperwork in plain manila envelopes. Some accepted the envelopes with puzzled expressions, while others refused to take them, slamming doors in his face. Either way, John knew the message would get through soon enough. By evening, word spread like wildfire among the HOA leadership. Emergency meetings were called, frantic phone calls exchanged, and lawyers scrambled to decipher the situation. At EO, first, many dismissed the claim as some kind of prank or misunderstanding. How could a single homeowner possibly wrest control of communal property away from the entire association? Surely there must be a loophole, or so they thought. But as the board members dug deeper into the fine print, panic began to set in. There it was, black and white. The clause John had activated. Their own negligence in blocking the easement had triggered the transfer of ownership. Worse still, because the clause had been part of the original deed and subsequently upheld during John's purchase, they had no grounds to dispute its validity. They were trapped in their own web of rules and arrogance. The next day, the HOA convened an emergency meeting. Normally, these gatherings drew only a handful of residents, but this time the room was packed. Whispers filled the air as neighbors speculated about why John hadn't taken legal action sooner. Some assumed he lacked resources. Others thought he was too intimidated by the HOA's power. No one suspected the truth, that John had been playing a long game, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. When John entered the room, all eyes turned to him. Board members looked pale and agitated, scribbling notes furiously as they tried to figure out their next move. John, however, remained calm and composed. He took a seat near the back, content to let the chaos unfold around him. The president of the HOA, a stern woman named Margaret, stood at the front of the room and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we are facing an unprecedented challenge. A technicality in one of our deeds has created complications regarding certain communal properties." Her vague explanation drew murmurs of confusion from the audience. Someone shouted, "What does that mean? What's going on?" Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, another board member stepped forward, a man named Richard who usually spoke with authority, but now seemed unusually flustered. "It appears that due to circumstances beyond our control, partial ownership of some shared amenities may have transferred to an individual homeowner." Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, trying to process what they'd just heard. "Who?" someone demanded. "Which homeowner?" Before anyone could answer, John raised his hand casually. "That would be me," he said, standing up. His voice carried a quiet confidence that silenced the room instantly. All eyes were on him now, wide with disbelief. Richard cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Thompson, we understand your frustration with the easement issue. However, this development is highly irregular. We need time to review the matter thoroughly and determine the best course of action." John crossed his arms and leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but commanding. "I've already given you plenty of time," he said evenly. 31 days to be exact. You chose to ignore my concerns and violate the terms of my deed. Now the consequences are clear. The tension in the room was palpable. Board members exchanged panicked looks, whispering urgently among themselves. Meanwhile, the other homeowners stared at John with a mix of awe and suspicion. Some admired his boldness, while others worried about what this meant for the community. Over the next few days, the HOA launched a desperate campaign to undo the damage. They hired high-powered attorneys, filed motions to contest the transfer, and even attempted to negotiate privately with John. Offers poured in, everything from reopening the easement immediately to offering financial compensation. But John held firm. He wasn't interested in half measures or hollow promises. If they wanted to resolve the situation, they'd have to meet his terms completely. Behind closed doors, the HOA debated their options. Some board members argued for fighting John tooth and nail, convinced they could find a loophole or technicality to invalidate the clause. Others pleaded for compromise, fearing the public relations nightmare that would ensue if news of the debacle leaked beyond the neighborhood. After all, the idea of a lone homeowner outsmarting the almighty HOA was the stuff of headlines, and not the kind they wanted. Meanwhile, John continued living his life as if nothing extraordinary was happening. He worked on clearing more land for his future cabin, tended to the small garden he'd started, and occasionally waved at passing neighbors. To the outside world, he seemed unfazed by the storm brewing around him. Inside, though, he allowed himself moments of quiet triumph. Every call from the HOA, every panicked email, reinforced the fact that he'd played his cards perfectly. As the standoff dragged on, cracks began to form within the HOA itself. Board members accused each other of incompetence, while frustrated, residents grew vocal about their dissatisfaction. Petitions circulated demanding transparency and accountability. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, enforcing strict rules and punishing those who dared question their authority. Now, their own missteps had exposed their vulnerabilities, and everyone was watching. Finally, after weeks of fruitless resistance, the HOA conceded defeat. They reopened the easement, removed the barricades, and issued a formal apology to John. In addition, they agreed to compensate him for damages incurred during the blockade and cover his legal fees. Most importantly, they promised never to obstruct access to his property again. For John, it was more than just a victory. It was validation. The HOA had underestimated him, assuming he'd fold under pressure or lack the resources to fight back. Instead, he'd turned their aggression into opportunity, using their own arrogance against them. And while he graciously allowed them to retain full ownership of the communal spaces, he made sure the lesson stuck. From that point forward, the HOA treated him with a newfound respect and a healthy dose of caution. As the dust settled, John returned to his routine, focusing once again on building his dream home. But the experience left an indelible mark, not just on him but on the entire community. Rumors of his triumph spread far and wide, inspiring others to stand up against unfair treatment. And though John rarely spoke of it himself, the knowing glint in his eye whenever the topic arose told everyone exactly what they needed to know. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being smarter than your opponent. The fallout from John's activation of the hidden clause hit the HOA like a tidal wave. What started as whispers among neighbors quickly escalated into full-blown panic within the association's leadership. The board members, who had once wielded their authority with an iron fist, now found themselves scrambling to contain the chaos they had inadvertently unleashed. Their arrogance had blinded them to the consequences of their actions, and now they were paying the price. When the HOA received John's official notice, delivered neatly in manila envelopes stamped with legal language, they initially dismissed it as some kind of bluff. Surely no single homeowner could override decades of established rules and claim ownership of communal property. But as lawyers pored over the documents and confirmed the validity of the clause, the reality sank in. John wasn't bluffing. He had played by the rules better than anyone else, and he'd won. At first, the HOA tried to downplay the situation. Board members held closed-door meetings, hoping to resolve the issue quietly without alarming the rest of the community. They drafted vague statements about administrative oversights and promised swift action to address the easement closure. Privately, however, they were unraveling. Emails flew back and forth between attorneys, insurance providers, and real estate experts, each one painting a bleaker picture. If John followed through on his claim, the HOA stood to lose not only part of their clubhouse, but also revenue streams tied to events hosted at the facility. Worse still, news of the debacle would tarnish their reputation far beyond the neighborhood. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in tight-knit communities. Within days, rumors began circulating among residents. At first, they were hushed conversations over backyard fences or cryptic posts on neighborhood message boards. Did you hear? Something big is going on with the HOA. Then came the leaks. Documents accidentally left on copy machines, snippets of heated arguments overheard during meetings. By the end of the week, everyone knew the truth. John Thompson had triggered a clause that gave him partial ownership of shared amenities unless the HOA acted immediately. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had once viewed John as a quiet, unassuming newcomer suddenly saw him in a new light. Some admired his cleverness, secretly cheering for him as he took on the oppressive HOA. Others worried about what this meant for their own properties. Would assessments increase to cover potential losses? Could other homeowners follow suit and activate similar clauses? Amid the growing tension, the HOA called an emergency meeting to address the crisis head-on. The room was packed, standing room only, as residents gathered to hear what the board had to say. Margaret, the president of the HOA, stood at the podium looking unusually pale. Her usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by visible anxiety. She cleared her throat and began speaking, her voice shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, struggling to maintain composure, "we are currently dealing with a complex legal matter involving one of our homeowners. While we cannot disclose all details due to ongoing discussions, we want to assure you that your interests remain our top priority." Her vague explanation did little to quell the rising tide of questions. Hands shot up across the room, demanding answers. One neighbor shouted, "What does this mean for us? Are we losing the pool, the tennis courts?" Another chimed in, "Why didn't you fix the easement problem when it started?" Margaret fumbled for a response, but before she could speak, Richard, the vice president of the HOA, stepped forward. His face was red, either from anger or embarrassment. "Let me be clear," he said, his tone sharp. "This development is unprecedented. It stems from a technicality in a deed that none of us anticipated. We are working tirelessly to resolve the issue and protect our community assets." John sat quietly in the back row, observing the spectacle unfold. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone spoke volumes. As the board members squirmed under the weight of their mistakes, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about winning. It was about holding the HOA accountable for their abuse of power. Over the next few weeks, the HOA launched a desperate campaign to undo the damage. They hired high-profile attorneys, filed motions to contest the transfer of ownership, and even attempted to renegotiate directly with John. Offers poured in, ranging from reopening the easement immediately to offering substantial financial compensation. But John remained unmoved. He listened politely to their proposals, thanked them for their efforts, and reiterated his stance. He wouldn't settle for anything less than full compliance with the terms of the clause. Privately, the HOA debated their options. Some board members argued for taking the fight to court, convinced they could find a loophole or technicality to invalidate the clause. Others urged caution, warning that a public legal battle would only make matters worse. "If this gets out to the media," one member whispered during a heated discussion, "we'll look like bullies who got outsmarted by a homeowner. Our credibility will be destroyed." As the standoff dragged on, cracks began to form within the HOA itself. Long simmering tensions boiled over as board members blamed each other for the mess. Margaret accused Richard of failing to properly vet the easement closure decision, while Richard shot back that Margaret should have caught the clause during routine inspections. Meanwhile, Frustrated residents grew increasingly vocal, demanding transparency and accountability. Petitions circulated calling for reforms to the HOA's policies and even ousting current board members. For John, the experience was surreal. Every day brought a new twist, whether it was another panicked phone call from the HOA or a neighbor stopping by to congratulate him on standing up to the tyrannical board. Yet despite the whirlwind around him, he stayed focused. He continued working on his land, clearing brush, planting trees, and sketching plans for his future home. To the outside world, he appeared calm and collected, as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Inside, though, he allowed himself moments of quiet triumph. Each failed attempt by the HOA to undermine him reinforced the fact that he'd played his cards perfectly. Finally, after weeks of resistance, the HOA threw in the towel. They reopened the easement, removing the barricades and ensuring it remained accessible. In addition, they issued a formal apology to John, acknowledging their mismanagement and promising to prevent similar issues in the future. Most importantly, they agreed to compensate him for damages incurred during the blockade, including lost workdays and legal fees, and pledged never to obstruct access to his property again. In return, John graciously allowed the HOA to retain full ownership of the communal spaces. Though he technically had the right to co-own parts of the clubhouse and recreational areas, he recognized that doing so might create unnecessary friction within the community. Instead, he chose to focus on rebuilding trust and moving forward. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he told the board during their final negotiation. "I just want fair treatment, and I think we've reached that point." The agreement marked the end of a grueling chapter for both John and the HOA. For the board, it was a humbling lesson in humility and accountability. For John, it was vindication, a testament to the power of preparation, patience, and perseverance. And for the rest of the community, it was a wake-up call. The once dominant HOA had been exposed as fallible, its unchecked authority challenged by a single, determined individual. As life slowly returned to normal, John resumed his routine, pouring his energy into building his dream home. But the ripple effects of his victory lingered. Neighbors approached him with newfound respect, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA and expressing gratitude for his courage. Others began questioning the association's policies, pushing for greater transparency and fairness. Even the board adopted a more conciliatory tone, eager to repair its damaged image. Though John rarely spoke of the ordeal himself, the knowing glint in his eye whenever the topic arose told everyone exactly what they needed to know. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud or flashy, it's quiet, calculated, and utterly unstoppable. With the easement reopened and the HOA humbled, John finally felt a sense of peace settle over him. The months-long battle had been exhausting, mentally, emotionally, and physically, but it was worth every moment. He had taken on an organization that thrived on control and intimidation, and he had emerged victorious. Now, as he stood on his land, breathing in the crisp morning air, he allowed himself to reflect on everything that had happened. Life began returning to normal, or at least, as close to normal as it could get after such a dramatic showdown. The barricades were gone, replaced by freshly graded gravel along the easement road. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved enthusiastically when they passed by. Some even stopped to chat, thanking John for standing up to the HOA and expressing hope that his victory might lead to lasting change within the community. It wasn't just about the easement anymore. It was about setting a precedent. If one homeowner could challenge the HOA and win, maybe others could too. John appreciated the support, but remained focused on his original goal, building his dream home. With access restored, he threw himself into the project with renewed energy. Days turned into weeks as he worked tirelessly, clearing trees, leveling ground, and laying the foundation for what would eventually become a cozy cabin nestled among the woods. Every swing of the axe, every shovel of dirt, reminded him why he'd fought so hard to protect this place. Yet despite his outward focus on construction, John couldn't ignore the ripple effects of his actions. Word of his triumph spread far, beyond the neighborhood, becoming something of a local legend. At first, it was whispered conversations at community gatherings or casual mentions during coffee runs. Then came articles in small-town newspapers praising John's cleverness and determination. Homeowner outsmarts HOA in legal showdown, read one headline. Another described him as the quiet rebel who changed the rules. Neighbors often joked about how John had single-handedly reformed the HOA overnight. While that wasn't entirely true, the board still existed and continued enforcing some rules. It was undeniable that their approach had shifted. Gone were the days of arbitrary fines and harsh penalties. Instead, the HOA adopted a more collaborative tone, inviting feedback from residents and addressing concerns with genuine effort rather than dismissive platitudes. Even Margaret, the formerly stern president, seemed softer, almost apologetic during meetings. For John, the transformation was satisfying but not entirely surprising. He had always believed that people respond best when confronted with accountability. By exposing the HOA's vulnerabilities, he hadn't just won a personal victory, he had forced them to confront their own flaws. And while he doubted they would ever fully embrace humility, he hoped the experience would serve as a lesson. Power unchecked breeds resentment, and fairness requires constant vigilance. As autumn gave way to winter, John found himself reflecting on the broader impact of his journey. Beyond the legal battles and neighborhood gossip, he realized his story carried a universal message. Life is full of obstacles, whether they come in the form of blocked roads, bureaucratic red tape, or domineering organizations. But overcoming those challenges often boils down to two things: preparation and perseverance. Planning ahead gives you tools to navigate uncertainty, while patience ensures you don't act impulsively out of frustration. Together, they create a powerful combination, one that can turn even the most daunting odds in your favor. One evening, as snow began dusting the ground, John invited a few neighbors over for hot cocoa around a bonfire. It was a rare social outing for him, but he felt it was important to connect with the people who had supported him throughout the ordeal. As flames crackled and marshmallows toasted, conversation inevitably turned to the infamous easement incident. "So, John," said Tom, a retired teacher who lived down the road, "what's next for you? Any other secret clauses hidden in that deed?" The group erupted in laughter, and John chuckled along. "Nope," he replied, shaking his head. "I think I've used up my quota of surprises for this lifetime. But seriously," added Sarah, another neighbor, "you've inspired all of us. We've started talking about forming a committee to review the HOA's policies. Maybe we can make sure something like this doesn't happen again." John nodded approvingly. "That's a great idea. The more involved everyone is, the harder it'll be for anyone to abuse their power." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but John noticed a subtle shift in the group's dynamic. People spoke with confidence, unafraid to voice their opinions or share ideas. It was a stark contrast to the fearful silence that had dominated the neighborhood before. In that moment, John realized his victory extended beyond property lines. He had sparked a movement, a quiet rebellion against complacency and injustice. Winter melted into spring, and progress on John's cabin accelerated. Walls went up, windows were installed, and soon the structure began resembling the cozy retreat he'd envisioned. On weekends, curious neighbors stopped by to check on the construction, offering tips or simply admiring the craftsmanship. Some even pitched in, helping with painting or landscaping. What had once been a solitary endeavor became a shared celebration of resilience and community spirit. By summer, the cabin was complete. Its wooden beams glowed warmly in the sunlight, blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Inside, John decorated sparingly, preferring simplicity over clutter. A comfortable couch faced a stone fireplace, while shelves lined with books created cozy nooks for reading. Outside, a wraparound porch offered sweeping views of the land he had fought so hard to protect. On the day he officially moved in, John hosted a small gathering to thank those who had supported him. Friends, neighbors, and even a few former HOA members attended, bringing dishes and drinks to share. As dusk fell, lanterns flickered softly, casting golden light across the yard. Someone brought out a guitar and impromptu songs filled the air. Laughter echoed through the trees, mingling with the chirping of crickets. Standing on his porch looking out at the crowd, John felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was what he had been fighting for. Not just a piece of land, but a place where connections could flourish, where fairness and respect mattered more than rules and regulations. He raised a glass in a silent toast, savoring the knowledge that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. In the months that followed, John settled into his new routine. Mornings were spent tending to his garden, or taking long walks through the woods. Afternoons were reserved for reading or tinkering with projects around the cabin. Evenings, however, were his favorite time. Sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, he often thought about the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy, but every challenge had shaped him into the person he was today. Occasionally, someone from outside the neighborhood would reach out, asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA disputes. John listened patiently, offering guidance without ever claiming to have all the answers. Sometimes, he'd say, the best thing you can do is stay calm and think ahead. You never know when a little planning might save the day. His story continued to inspire others, both locally and beyond. Articles about his victory popped up online, sparking discussions about homeowners' rights and the balance of power between individuals and associations. Podcasts featured interviews with experts analyzing the legal implications of the clause he'd activated. Even real estate agents began citing his case as an example of why thorough title searches are crucial. But for John, the attention was secondary. What mattered most was the life he had built, the peaceful existence he cherished, surrounded by nature and good company. He didn't need recognition or accolades. He already had everything he wanted. Still, there were moments when he couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. The HOA, once so determined to control him, had inadvertently handed him the keys to their kingdom. Their arrogance had blinded them to the consequences of their actions, leaving them vulnerable to the very rules they prided themselves on enforcing. And John, well, he had simply played the game better than anyone else. As he sat on his porch one final evening, watching fireflies dance in the twilight, John allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Life, he mused, has a funny way of rewarding those who plan carefully and persevere patiently. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet, calculated, and utterly unstoppable.